The first cry of morning came before the birds found their notes. Eulalie felt it through the floorboards of the sick house, a tremor of sound that traveled into her bones the way a river's current travels into the hands of a patient oarswoman. She rose from the stool where she'd been mending a torn swaddling and tucked the needle into the hem of her sleeve. Out the single square window, the humid dark of Carolina was lifting, fog laying its pale hands over the cane fields, the big house's white columns ghostly and far, and the river beyond everything like a strip of hammered pewter. The cry came again, shorter this time, edged with the mother's breath breaking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. She crossed the threshold before the rooster could cut the air. The path to the quarters was ribbed with roots and last night's rain, a slick seam that taught a careful foot. Eulalie's hands were clean, always clean. She kept a basin at the door and wood ash for scrubbing when lye ran low. People said the smell of birth and of grief lived in her skin like a second name, sweet and sharp as the marigolds she dried and crushed for teas. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that names and smells, like wind and rumor, did as they pleased. Tansy's cabin held the kind of heat that makes breath drink itself. The young woman lay on a pallet near the hearth, knees drawn, the back of her head against a folded dress. Her husband, Caleb, hovered useless and trying not to be. "Out," Eulalie murmured without looking at him, and Caleb went, grateful to be banished by someone with authority. She kneeled, pressed her palm against Tansy's crown, and listened. The labor had been slow and crooked, the way a branch grows toward light through fence slats. Eulalie laid out her tools, boiled twine, clean rag, a tin spoon for teeth if the pain climbed too high. She spoke little. Words could be a clumsy kind of medicine. Instead, she worked with touch and breath, the rhythm of a long memory. Women who had placed their faith inside her hands because there was nowhere else to put it. Children who had entered the world under her gaze and either stayed or did not. When the child came, he came as if testing the air, shoulders reluctant, tidy mouth pressed into a line that made Eulalie think of a man about to be told a hard truth. A half turn, a coaxing slide, and he was there, wailing furious and whole. She saw the cord looped once around the small neck, loose enough to free with her thumb, and then she held him up so that Tansy could see the proof that pain might sometimes purchase blessing. "Little stone," Tansy breathed, tears slicking her temples. "My little stone." Eulalie smiled without showing teeth. Stones do not blow away. She nestled the boy to his mother's breast, wrapped them both, cleaned the space in a rhythm that made a ritual out of order. She stamped her mind around all the things that might yet go wrong, the hidden fever, the night bleed, the breath that forgets itself, and she did the work that kept those possibilities quiet. Outside, day had arrived proper. Smoke from cookfire stitched itself to the low sky. The bell at the big house rang late, an indulgence that meant the master had lost at cards or the mistress had spent an extra hour peering into her own reflection. Eulalie worked by clocks that had nothing to do with bells. She left Tansy and Caleb in the tender hush of after, told them what to drink, what to avoid, and where to rub the oil she pressed from bear fat and bay laurel. She stepped back into the yard and felt the day arrange itself around her, tasks like beads sliding onto a string. A sore ankle to bind, a weeping boil to lance, the small ledger to update with names and weights. She had kept the ledger for 13 years. She hid it beneath the sick house floor with the blue bottles of tincture and the thin, barbed shovel. It was not a proper book, nothing more than scraps sewn into a spine, paper pilfered from broken crates, a bit of pasted wallpaper from the mistress's cast-offs making up its last page. In it she wrote the truth. Children's names, measurements, the sign of their first breath or the sign of their last. She did not write the master's preferred tallies, the ones sent to the factors in town, only the real ones, the ones that mattered. There were 127 births inside those pages. There were also 31 small crosses she drew in the margins when a little life did not continue past the day of its coming. She marked those crosses because forgetting was a kind of death she refused to midwife. The mistress, who considered herself God's secretary, would have said Eulalie was sentimental. Eulalie considered herself something else, a witness that did not look away. The first time the mistress had called her sentimental, it had been because Eulalie buried things. When a child was born without breath, or with breath that flickered and went out like a tallow candle down to its last guttering, Eulalie washed and wrapped the small body in a strip of clean cloth. She sang a plain song with no words and carried that corner of the world to a stand of chinaberry trees near the river, where the ground kept itself soft and the water spoke. She dug with the thin shovel, whose handle she had cut and sanded herself. She marked the place with a shell or a necessary stone. She never buried alone. "Let the river keep," she would say to the women who walked with her, and they would echo back as if the words were the only prayer that had not been confiscated. The overseer knew about the place. He pretended not to. The master likely did not, though his hounds had scented that direction more than once. The mistress had a nose for everything but grief. Eulalie kept the place anyway, a secret visible to those who needed it and hidden from those who did not deserve it. She cleaned the shovel with sand after each use and laid it beneath the floorboards next to the ledger and the blue bottles. She pretended the act of closing the floor again made the knowledge safe. Pretending, too, has its uses. By noon, heat had screwed the lid down tight. Eulalie braided her hair and wound a strip of linen around her wrist where an old injury awoke when the weather pressed its thumb down. She thought of dinner, of corn pones and salt pork and a few collards if the patch had outpaced the rabbits, and then of the thing that stood in the way of eating, a summons from the big house. "Bring the midwife," the girl said when she reached Eulalie's door, their feet black with yard. The girl did not lower her eyes as an older one might have. These new children had grown up watching the way Eulalie moved through the place, the way even the overseer stepped aside without naming it that. Authority has a smell, like iron warmed by sun. "What for?" Eulalie asked. The girl shrugged. "Missus wants you to look at something." In the big house's rear corridor, the boards did not complain under Eulalie's weight the way they did for other feet. She knew where the planks gave, where the wallpaper peeled, where a portrait's eye had loosened in its socket and leaned toward the floor in permanent suspicion. The master's hunting prints watched from the walls, dogs frozen in mid-bay, gentlemen in fine coats mid-brag. The mistress waited in her morning room, curtains thick enough to make day feel like the inside of a mouth. She sat beside a table laid with a glass of lemon water she would not finish and a Bible she kept as a stylet between herself and the parts of the world she preferred not to see. "Eulalie," she said, her tone a pinch, "we are to have callers. Your hands are very capable, but I want no evidence of your errands about the place today." Eulalie kept her eyes on the baseboard, wood that had never done anyone harm. "My hands do as they are asked," she said. "You bury people," the mistress said, as if stating a misbehavior. "You always have. I have spoken before about the impropriety of making a spectacle." Eulalie thought of the stand of chinaberry trees. She thought of how quiet graves make no spectacle at all unless a conscience trips over them in the dark. She nodded without agreement. The mistress's mouth softened, sensing compliance where there was only silence. "A doctor is coming, Dr. Vale from town. He will see to Abigail's confinement when the time comes, and I do not want him finding your practices. He is modern." The last word held the same awe she used her Paris dresses. Eulalie felt heat roll under her sternum at the name. Abigail was the mistress's daughter, raven-haired and restless, married 8 months to a cotton factor who spent his attention heaping silver, not favors. Abigail had called for Eulalie twice in the last month when the pulsing under her left ribs made her breath short and her nights long.
Eulalie had measured the girl's pelvis with her hands and found it good. She had counted the days on a string of knotted thread and found them orderly. She had given Abigail tea to soften fear. She had said nothing about doctors. Dr. Vale does not take advice from women, the mistress said now, anticipating a protest Eulalie would not make aloud. He takes fees. The mistress dismissed her with a lift of the chin, and Eulalie walked back through the corridor with the feeling of a river turned by a sudden dam. Change had a way of arriving with the sugar of polite words cracked over it like a crust. Still, Abigail's care would remain a river with many small channels. Eulalie would see to the ones that mattered. The doctor came before the thunderheads, a man whose coat's velvet collar announced a high opinion of his own pulse. He smelled faintly of camphor and louder of clove. He looked at Eulalie in the manner of men who have learned all they think a body can teach them from other men's mouths and from dead women's bellies. He addressed her as if she were a piece of furniture that could be useful in a pinch. "Strong hands," he said, turning her wrist slightly as though he had discovered it there. "Keep them clean." Eulalie thought, "I have kept babies alive with these hands you notice now, and your noticing changes nothing about the doing." She nodded and let him pass. He examined Abigail with the briskness of a northerly wind. He asked questions Eulalie had already asked and cut off the answers because he preferred his own. He announced a regimen that smelled like a barber shop and left a packet of powders that would draw water from a river if set upon its bank. When Abigail's breath caught with a stitch of pain, Eulalie steadied her eyes and lent her own breath until the girl remembered how.
After, when the doctor had gone and the mistress had applied lemon water to her own nerves, Eulalie walked Abigail to the veranda where a potted rosemary swelled against its clay boundary. They stood without touching, two women at different ends of a string someone else held. "I am frightened," Abigail said in a voice so honest it seemed to surprise itself. "Keep your feet warm," Eulalie said. "Eat. Listen to your body as if it were a wise ant who talks soft. When pain comes, do not chase it with fear. Let it burn out its own wick." Abigail looked at the far pasture where the mules cut the day into furrows. "Do you bury them all?" she asked suddenly, like a child blurting a rude curiosity. "I bury the ones who do not stay," Eulalie said. "Why there, near the river?" "Because the river knows how to carry what weight a body cannot," Eulalie said. "And because water changes slowly, only in the eyes of those who do not watch it long." Abigail swallowed. If I do not stay, will you take me there?" The question struck like lightning that wants to be a blessing and cannot find how. Eulalie did not let it make a mark on her face. "You will stay," she said, "but yes." Abigail nodded, understanding more than she should have about promises and the shape of mercy. A wind came then, lifting the rosemary to rub its hands together, and thunder spoke without hurry from beyond the trees. That night, the storm ratcheted the house. Rain banged the roof and then turned to sheets as smooth as slate. Eulalie sat in the sick house with her ledger open, the blue bottle of valerian near, the thin shovel's handle against her ankle like a reminder. She wrote the day, Tansy's son, a little stone, shoulders reluctant, nuchal loop relieved, lungs open like doors, Caleb's awe, the mistress's pinch, Dr. Vale's clove. She closed the ledger and set it beneath the floor, along with the bottle and the shovel, then sat on the boards above them while the storm argued itself down into the roots. She listened for the sound she most feared and most expected, a knock that did not belong to any friend. It came just before midnight, not a knock, but a voice at the door, urgent and half-broken. "Eulalie, please." She rose with the calm that sits on people who have learned to move while thinking. The door swung inward. A boy stood on the threshold, no hat, hair wet as a seal. He worked in the stables and had a name like a place, Shiloh or Camden, one of those the white men liked for reasons that had nothing to do with the boys themselves. "It's Ruth," he said, breath hitching. "Her time is wrong. She's bleeding." Eulalie had been waiting for Ruth's day the way a sailor watches a sky without knowing which cloud will crack first. Ruth's last confinement had turned on a needle's point and stayed only because Eulalie had placed her weight there with both hands. Eulalie took the basket of tools, wrapped a shawl against the rain's hands, and followed the boy into the dark path. Ruth's cabin held the smell of iron. Blood has a way of insisting on its name. The woman's face shone with sweat and something like fury, the kind of anger that keeps a person here. Eulalie put both palms on the woman's belly and felt the storm inside answer the one out. "Child is sideways," she said, the words quiet as a blade. "We can ask him to turn." Ruth's eyes hooked into Eulalie's with ferocity. "Ask," she said through her teeth. What followed was long and delicate, a conversation conducted entirely in muscle and breath. Eulalie coaxed the child with the patience of a person untangling a snarl in good thread. She used the spoon once, pressed hard against Ruth's molars when the pain went too white for the room. She ignored the overseer's wife hovering in the doorway, pretending concern while counting how many minutes of labor could be spared from the field tomorrow. When the baby came, it was with a rush and a silence that cut Eulalie between one heartbeat and the next. He lay in her hands, small and blue-lipped, as if the world had made an offer and he had not yet decided whether to accept it. She rubbed him with the rough cloth that wakes stubborn lungs, tapped the soles, breathed against his nose and mouth. The room tightened its grip on time.
"Stay," she demanded softly, as if the child were a man already inclined to leave. "Stay now." He did. A squeak, a sputter, the thin insistence of a newborn's claim, and the blue washed toward pink like dawn playing fair. Ruth sobbed once, great and ungraceful. The overseer's wife made a remark about the mess and left before anyone could see her cry in sympathy with people she had not meant to have. Eulalie sat against the wall after she had cleaned and bound and pinned the world back onto its hinges. She let her eyes close for the time it takes a moth to find a lamp. Knock, again. Not the stable boy's voice, a heavy hand, impatient with weather. The door opened without waiting for the word to. The master came in with his hat still on and rain scoring his cheeks like a child might who did not know when to stop. Behind him, Dr. Vale stood like a portrait of a man who would prefer to be elsewhere while wishing to be admired anyway. "Where is the expectant?" the master said, planting his boots on Ruth's swept floor as if claiming a hill. He looked younger when angry, as if petulance peeled away the years. "No expectant here," Eulalie said without rising. "A mother, delivered." Dr. Vale brushed water from his sleeve with a fastidiousness that made the room want to laugh if it had the freedom. "We were diverted by the storm. The bridge beyond the sugar house is out. He gestured vaguely at the master as if he were merely the concept of a man. "Driver said a woman in the quarters required attention." His gaze found the blood on the floor and he frowned, not at the sign of danger past, but at the insult to his shoes. The master looked at Ruth, at the child tucked to her chest, and then at Eulalie, because the shape of a thing could not be blamed, but the hands that made it could. He had lost money in town, Eulalie could smell it like old smoke, and he needed to spend the loss on a body that could not answer back with a bill. "You will come to the big house," he told Eulalie. "Abigail is unwell, the doctor says." Eulalie stood as if she had intended to all along, and tied her shawl tighter as if it were merely a habit. She touched Ruth's foot, a promise laid there with the weight of a thumb. She took her basket and nodded to the boy with the place name to keep the fire low and the water near. They crossed the yard in a staggered procession, the master's impatience first, Dr. Vale's injured dignity next, Eulalie's steady stride rounding the pair into sense. The rain came in pulses as if the sky were swallowing and deciding against it. Abigail lay turned toward the window as if expecting light to argue her back into herself. Her skin had the waxen sheen of a candle deciding whether to gut her. The mistress hovered near the bed, one hand on a drawer as if its contents could be pressed against whatever bled inside her daughter. She began with pains after supper, then a gush, not the usual. She broke into a hard whisper. "It is too early." Eulalie wove to the bed without waiting to be granted rank she did not need. She pressed her hand against Abigail's belly and felt the looseness there, the way a river loses its course when a bank gives way. Her palm came away with blood dark as molasses and as final. "Lie still," Eulalie said into the air above the girl, and Abigail obeyed because the timbre of the words held a shelter. Dr. Vale produced his powders and his pride. He announced we must bleed her to balance the humors, already tightening a band on Abigail's arm. Eulalie looked at the mistress's face and saw there a terror that would sign any paper put before it. "No," Eulalie said, not loudly, but with a weight that moved the furniture of the moment. "She has already bled. She needs rest, warmth, and the child's quiet. If there is a child still to be coaxed toward staying—" She did not say aloud the name for what she suspected, a placenta that had loosened its hold. The master bristled. "You do not overrule a physician in my house." Eulalie did not look at him, and in that failure to regard lay the seed of what would come. "I have pulled more mothers back from the dark than he has read about," she said, still to the air, and it was not a boast but a measure. The mistress swallowed. "Do what must be done," she whispered, but it was unclear to whom she spoke. In the end, as such things go, Eulalie did the doing, while the doctor performed his idea of it, and the master performed command. She brewed a tea that warmed Abigail from the throat down, placed warmed bricks at the soles of her feet, spoke the kind of words that knit a person to the world by their edges. She watched for the signs that would tell her which path the night intended.
The storm burned itself lower, embers thrown across the horizon, and in that quieter, the room's true sounds returned. The catch of Abigail's breath, the dry turn of Bible pages in the mistress's fearful hands, the master's pacing like a child who does not want to be told no. Dr. Vale slept sitting up, the clove having lost its battle with weariness. Near dawn, Abigail startled awake with a cry that was not pain so much as the body's remembering. Eulalie was already there, one hand on the curve of the girl's belly, the other on her wrist. A contraction rose, stubborn but not insurmountable. Another followed. The bleeding slowed, then stilled. It was not triumph. It was reprieve. "You will rest the entire day," Eulalie told Abigail once the worst had slid by. "You will not sit in a bath of any doctor's making. You will not be bled. You will take broth and the sun if it shows its face." The mistress nodded, the kind of nod that happens when a person has visited a place where their rules do not apply and returned wanting only to avoid the trip again. The master said nothing, which was its own kind of pride. When Eulalie reached the sick house again, the world had the washed look a morning wears after surviving itself. She sat on the floorboards above the ledger and the shovel and the blue bottles and closed her eyes with the intention of opening them moments later. Her nap was a thin thread cut by a sound she knew too well, a man's laughter outside her door with no joy in it. She rose and pulled the door open before knuckles could bruise the wood. The overseer stood there with two men from the neighboring place and a shovel longer than Eulalie's thin one. He smiled in the way of people who have explained something terrible to themselves and found the explanation convenient. "Doctor wants the yard tidy," he said. "Mrs. too. They say you keep trash buried near the river where decent folk might wander and find it. We're to set it right."
Eulalie looked past him at the sky, which had chosen a pious blue to disguise its capacity for storm. She looked at his shovel, at the men's hands, at the direction of their boots. "No," she said. The overseer's smile slackened. "Not yours to say." "It is," Eulalie said, and the word did not sound like denial. It sounded like a door clicking in a quiet house, a latch set from the inside. "You will not disturb the river's keep." He laughed again, that shineless sound, and stepped past her as if she were smoke. The men followed. The path toward the chinaberries opened like a scar in the grass where so many careful feet had walked with so many careful bundles. Eulalie felt her lungs go tight like a fist around a small thing. She walked after them because walking had always been the only way between one place and another. She did not run. Running wastes the breath you will need. At the stand of trees, the men set their shovels into earth that had learned her name. The overseer cleared his throat as if preparing to sing at church, and then pressed his boot against the blade to widen the cut. Eulalie felt the ground shiver through her ankles and up the long bones of her legs. She stood very still, and when stillness no longer served, she moved. "Stop," she said, but not to the men. She spoke to the day itself, to the river that had carried too much, to the bones that had learned to be quiet, because quiet is how the living stay alive. She stepped into the first hole and put both hands on the overseer's shovel. His eyes went wide in the small way that precedes true surprise. The men tensed as if they had just remembered every story they had ever heard about women who buried things and what happens when you tell such women no. "Missus wants it," the overseer said, and for the first time there was a question in it. Eulalie's voice belonged to someone whose name had not been said aloud in a very long time. "The river keeps what I ask it to keep. But the ground," she looked down at the neat cut in the earth and then back up into the man's face. "The ground will give back what I ask it to give." The men exchanged a look and then another, their boots uncertain. The overseer's mouth twitched into something that was not bravery. Eulalie released the shovel and stood on the lip of the cut earth. She closed her eyes in a manner that might have looked like prayer if anyone watching had remembered how to name it. Under her breath, she spoke the names from her ledger, not aloud, not like a challenge, but like a counting that steadies the world. She named the little ones who had not stayed. She pictured each shell, each necessary stone. She set those names on the morning as if they were weights sufficient to tip the day toward mercy. The river breathed. A wind came up from it and found the chinaberry leaves, setting them to a rattling that sounded like small bones remembering music. The men shifted their feet again, and the overseer's composure went ragged around the edges. "Enough of this," he said, and raised his shovel as if to break the spell, or the woman, or both. Eulalie opened her eyes. Somewhere behind the men, in the stand of trees, the earth sighed and then let go. A portion of the bank had been waiting all this wet season for one more insult to send it on its way. The insult arrived. The bank slid. The ground opened as politely as a seam, and just as irrevocably. In that opening, the river showed its teeth. One of the men stumbled forward with a cry and grabbed for a branch that had decided to be a snake. The overseer fell to his knees with a curse that ended in a prayer. Eulalie did not move. She felt the long-delayed power in the morning, the way a patient plan feels in the breath right before it becomes action. She did not smile because mercy does not, but something inside her straightened as if setting a tray down without spilling.
The river brought up what it had been asked to keep hidden, only until someone tried to snatch it away. Small shapes wrapped in cloth surfaced like truth bubbling through a lie. Shells knocked against roots. Stones knocked against stones. The men made sounds that belonged to boys. Eulalie stepped forward and reached with both hands, not to take anything, but to steady what the river had decided to show. Behind her, a voice she recognized and had not hoped to hear cut across the rattling leaves. "Good God," Dr. Vale said from the path, the mistress and the master crowding behind him as if they could climb into his disbelief and ride it to safety. "What indecent business is—" He stopped, because the words failed to accommodate the sight before him. Eulalie did not turn. "Those," the mistress said, not finishing the sentence, because finishing would require owning its end. "Those cannot be—" "They are," Eulalie said gently, because gentleness can be sharper than any knife. She kept her gaze on the water and on the bundles the river had raised, like a jury rising to deliver its verdict. The master spoke her name the way a man says a spell backward to undo it. "Eulalie." She finally turned then, her skirts wet to the knees, her hands steady. "You asked the ground to give back what it had been asked to keep hidden," she said. It obliged. The overseer climbed to his feet with mud on his hands, and something else on his face that might have been shame if the day persisted long enough. Dr. Vale made a sound like a man about to discover whether he believes in ghosts when there is no one left to impress. Eulalie stepped out of the hole and onto the slick grass. The river's surface smoothed in an instant, as if it had said what it had come to say and would not waste breath on repetition. She reached for the thin shovel at her belt and realized she had brought it without knowing she had. She felt the eyes of everyone who had ever mistaken her quiet for permission. "We will rewrap them," she said, simple as an instruction in a kitchen. "We will lay them again with care, and we will mark each place with a name." The mistress made a weak sound. "Names?" Eulalie touched the pocket where her ledger would soon be if she fetched it fast enough. "She have them," she said, "all but the ones who arrived without their mothers' voices to claim them. For those, we will choose names that do not belong to the people who did this." The master's face changed then, a small hardening that meant a decision had been taken somewhere deep and not in his mind. "You will give me that book, whatever book you keep. You will give it to me now." Eulalie's heart beat once against her throat in a way that said blood remembers the fastest routes. She did not look toward the sick house. "No." "You dare—" he began, and then stopped because daring had already been done, and pointing at it did not make it undare itself. "Fetch it," Dr. Dale said to the overseer, softly, in the tone of a man who wants to control a conversation he entered too late. "If there is a record, we will evaluate it." The overseer glanced at the river and at Eulalie, and at the shovel in her hand that was not large but had a purpose the whole place could now see. Eulalie bent, scooped water into her palm, and let it run off her fingers like a benediction she would claim even if it got her killed. "I will bring it," she said, and the surprise on their faces at her agreement gave her 3 extra breaths to think with. "But you will not touch it until I have read what is written, aloud." She looked at the mistress when she said it, because the mistress had always believed herself suited to readings. "What is this?" the master demanded, shaken from certainty by a morning that had refused to obey him. "Reckoning," Eulalie said. She wiped her hands on her skirt as if that could make them less clean. She turned toward the path that would take her to the sick house and the floorboards, and the ledger and the blue bottles. She walked, and no one stopped her because sometimes a woman's back tells the truth so clearly that interrupting would be a kind of blasphemy. She reached her door. She stepped inside. She pulled up the floor and gathered what waited there: book, bottle, shovel, and when she turned back toward the path, a shadow filled the threshold, blocking the light, and a voice she had prayed neither to hear nor to need said her name in a way that made the morning tilt. "Eulalie."
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The name sat in the doorway like a lantern that had been burning in a hidden room. Just enough light to show the dust you hadn't meant to breathe. She did not turn at once. Names that arrive that way can be traps, and a woman lives long by setting them down before she picks them up. The ledger lay under her palm. The blue bottle knocked her wrist like a heartbeat. The thin shovel leaned against the threshold as if it had always been a door jamb. Eulalie. She turned. Isaac the carpenter filled her doorway with shoulders he had learned to carry loads on. The left one sloped since the night a barrel fell, and nobody apologized. He was rain-dark and river-wet, and carrying the kind of fear men try not to set on the floor for others to see. "They're out there," he said, not yet remembering breath. "Doctor, overseer, master, Mrs., boys with curiosity and boots. The ground gave up what wouldn't stay kept, and they will want the book to make the dead behave." "They will want the book to behave for them," Eulalie said. He nodded once, relief loosening the string between his eyes that she had named correctly the thing pushing at his back. "I told Tansy to keep her door shut. Caleb went to the cane rows. Man thinks a stalk can shield a life if he stands close enough." He glanced at the floorboards where their secret slept. "Bring me some of it," he said softly. "The weight. Let me carry it with you." Eulalie said, "I'll carry my own, because love is not always the same shape as help." She slid the ledger into the deep pocket she had stitched between her skirt and her bone. She tucked the blue bottle into her bodice and took the thin shovel into her hand like a spoon. She looked past Isaac's shoulder into a morning suddenly made of witnesses. "Walk beside me," she allowed. They stepped together. From the river a coolness rose that belonged to places where truth had already been spoken and had no further need to shout. Chickens picked at the white seam of the path as if it were a wound they could close by pecking. The big house's veranda showed its teeth. Dr. Vale waited with his hat off, hair damp, eyes dilated by the kind of excitement some men reserve for theater and some for pain they do not have to pay themselves. The mistress held her Bible with her thumb inside, as if marking a verse she meant to throw like a rock. The master had chosen anger as a coat against weather and would shiver later when he took it off. Eulalie walked to the stand of chinaberries. The river moved like a long muscle, sinuous and sure. The first hole the overseer had cut gaped as if the earth were tired of polite edges. The bundles that the river had raised lay gathered on the bank like a chorus in small white throats. Someone, Ruth by the neatness, had already placed fresh cloths around those whose wrappings had sloughed away. Eulalie smelled rosemary and bay where a woman's hands had been. Work started without permission is a kind of miracle. "Eulalie! Eulalie! 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 Eulalie!" Eulalie climbed the small rise so that when she stood, her voice could find both river and house. She did not look at the master when she answered him. "You asked for the accounting. I will do the reading." Dr. Vale made a shape with his mouth that meant to be a smile if anyone had been foolish enough to call it that. "This," he said, gesturing to the river's reluctant offering, "is indecency and superstition. We will put it to rights. The proper authorities have not come," Eulalie said, "and would not know what to do if they had. There is only the river and us and the work." She looked at the mistress then, into the blue of a woman who had never been taught that blue sky can also drown you. "You ask to see, so you shall see, with their names." She opened the ledger. The paper rasped with the tenderness of worn cloth.
The first page carried the slant print she had taught herself when a scrap of newsprint told a lie about a woman she had buried, and she wanted to argue. She placed her finger under the first name and began. Amos, born to Dinah, in a July so hot even the hounds would not bark after noon. Lived 4 hours and a wheat loaf. Buried with a shell that looked like a small ear because he listened. Mercy, born to Prue, in a frost that lifted at midday like a quilt tugged off by a child. Stayed a day and a song. Wrapped in cloth the color of river clay because she belonged to this place without having asked to. Solomon, born to Hester, who had seen too much and said too little and did the reverse to save her heart. Lived 2 breaths and a whistle bird. The chinaberry reached toward him and we let it. Her voice knitted the air. The women from the quarters drifted closer without deciding to, pulled by the gravity of names spoken as if the dead could still hear their own. The men stood with their hats in their hands, because there are times when hands empty themselves for lack of anything better to do. The master took 1 step toward Eulalie and then stopped, because even a man absolute in his ignorance recognizes certain altars. When she reached the first blank, one of the babies born to a woman whose voice had been taken from her by a night that did not end when dawn came, Eulalie lifted her head. Some were unnamed, because a mouth cannot always find the shape of a thing while it is breaking. For them, we will choose names that fit. Names that fit do not belong to the people who broke them. Enough, the master said, but the word fell to the ground without work to do. Dr. Vale cleared his throat in a manner that hoped to call men around it like a bell. This narrative, this record, Eulalie said, keeping her eyes on the river. She would not argue genre with a man who had never held a first breath that might be a last. Now, Abigail, the mistress flinched, her thumb leaving its place in the Bible as if it had been caught stealing. You will not. Yesterday, Abigail bled as if the child were being asked to choose sooner than it wanted. The bleeding slowed. She rests. But I will set her name here because we name the living too to keep them where they belong. She wrote in the ledger with the stub of a pencil saved from a salesman's discarded pride. Abigail, sun-lashed, good pelvis, breath stolen by fear and returned by tea. Child uncertain, coaxed. Return to this entry when the child decides. The mistress stared as if words could be burned by looking. The master's lips were a line taught to be straight. Dr. Vale made a movement that might have been the human ghost of compassion, then extinguished it so quickly as if the river had snuffed a candle. Now, Eulalie said, and closed the book. We will bury what the river raised because it is indecent to keep it staring back at us and decent to let it rest. We will mark each with a name. Nobody moved until Ruth did, because sometimes the person who has most recently argued with death is the one everybody obeys without calling it that. She knelt and took the first small bundle as if it were an infant sleeping and not a memory. She placed it into the shallow bed of earth that had been chosen and coaxed and refused again. She whispered. Eulalie could not make out the words, which is how you can tell that a prayer belongs to the person saying it. The overseer hovered at the edge as if trying to decide whether superstition or defiance could be counted in the day's tally of misdemeanors. Not like that, he said weakly, unfamiliar with a room he had considered his own. Exactly like that, Eulalie said, and other women followed Ruth, a constellation of hands setting the sky to rights. They worked until sun scuffed the backs of their necks raw, and the first tremor of heat lifted gnats into a visible hymn.
They worked without the master's leave. They worked with ceremony and with the matter-of-factness of sweeping. Each little grave took a shape that did not belong to hunger or cotton or anyone's ledger but Eulalie's. When they finished, there were 31 small mounds as even as teeth in a young mouth and strewn with chinaberry leaves that would brown by evening like bread crusts. Eulalie set the thin shovel into the earth one last time and leaned her palm against its worn handle. "This ground," she said, "is a mouth closed after telling its piece. You will not open it again without reason worthy of upsetting the dead." She did not look at the master when she said it, but the words reached him and mussed his hair.
"God will decide what is worthy," the mistress said, and then saw that for once she might not be speaking for him. It should have ended there. Truth spoken, work done, the river allowed to return to its older business. But little quarrels, left without scolding, grow into men with shovels, and pride, denied a speech, will try to make itself into law. At sundown, when the day's labor had been counted unfairly as usual, and the corn pones had been counted fairly, because hunger makes mathematicians of us all, the master sent for Eulalie. She arrived in the back hall, where the wallpaper's faded vines were more honest than any sermon. The master stood with Dr. Vale and the overseer. The three of them made an arrangement of male certainty which they felt no need to apologize for. "The book," the master's voice had found its bell. "I will have it now." Eulalie placed her hand upon her pocket. "You will not." "Then you will be punished," he said, the way a man says he will smoke a cigar on the gallery. "You have set yourself above law and decency." "Decency is the work of the hands," Eulalie said. "Law is the work of paper. I will keep the paper." The overseer's fingers jumped as if a string had been plucked near them. Dr. Vale coughed into his glove, though nothing was in his throat except a tremor he did not wish to name. The master raised his chin, a gesture he had learned improved his height without improving his soul. "Bring her," he said to the overseer, and the man took a step. Abigail's voice came from the doorway behind them, soft with bed and hard with resolve. "No." All three men turned as if a bird had just performed a miracle and asked for tea. Abigail leaned against the doorframe, hair unpinned, eyes dark with the kind of knowing that comes when your body proves it can empty itself of more than blood. "She kept me," she said. "She will not be whipped for that." "Back to bed," the mistress hissed, not because she did not agree, perhaps, but because women who have stood too long on a platform built for them by men rarely step off even if the ground below is safer. Abigail stared at her mother as if recognizing, belatedly, someone she might have liked if each had been born elsewhere. "I will return to bed when this is settled." She looked at the ledger, where Eulalie's hand lay, considering the possibility of a world in which a book could be a barricade. The master changed his approach, as men do when force meets a wall they did not anticipate. "We will keep the book safe," he said, in a tone meant to be parental. "It will not be harmed, but such records belong to the house." "They belong to the ground," Eulalie said, "and to the women who walk it with children inside them, and to the children who do not stay. If your house wants a thing, it should learn to carry it without demanding that other hands put it there." Dr. Vale attempted diplomacy that could be mistaken for kindness if you were far away and the light was poor. "Madam," he said to Eulalie, and the word made the air cough, "we have asked no more than to examine the ledger for medical purposes." "You have asked to own people's grief with ink. I will not let you." She slid the book higher into her pocket until the paper warmed under her skin. There are moments when a room chooses sides. The hallway chose then. A board squeaked under the overseer as if warning him, and the lamp near the mistress hissed, wick drowned by its own oil. Abigail took one step toward Eulalie and another until she stood between the men and the woman with the book. "Then it is decided," the master said finally, with the certainty of those who think saying a thing can make it become. "You are dismissed from any services to this house." He flung the word services as if it were a bone and Eulalie a dog, and the hallway refused the insult and let it fall with a soft plop no one could step over with dignity. Eulalie inclined her head just enough to be mistaken for obedience if someone needed the lie. "Then I will serve who asks and deserves," she said. That night, a sky with no intention of rain nevertheless held its breath. The cicadas tightened and loosened their ropes. In the quarters, women lay with the special wakefulness of those who have been told tomorrow will require new muscles. Men slept with fists relaxed but ready. Children dreamed without knowing their dreams were shared. Near midnight, a scream tore the porch from the big house and left it hanging, not pain, terror. The voice was one that could empty a room of air even when it whispered. "Abigail," Eulalie said into the dark before the boy with the place name knocked. She was already moving. The big house had been roused into a kind of parody of itself. Lamps dashed from room to room as if the light could be poured where it was needed. The mistress's hair was unmade, her face unlearned. Dr. Vale had regained his coil and with it his set of procedures. The master's anger had finally found a use for itself, fear in costume. Abigail lay in a brightening red that made the sheets into riverbanks. "It hurts," she said calmly, and Eulalie loved her for the calm. "Let the pain do its work without letting it tear," Eulalie said, more mantra than instruction. She put her hands to the girl's belly and felt the child's panic as an animal's, strong, blind, certain only that the world had become too small. Dr. Vale approached with instruments that shone without promising anything. "We must extract," he said. "The placenta has—" "I know what it has and what it has not. Hold the lamp steady if you want to be useful." She glanced at the mistress, whose lips had lost their job description. Warm bricks, water, stillness. The mistress fled with relief at having an assignment that did not require seeing. The master hovered in the corner like smoke that refused to become flame for fear of being touted responsible. "If she dies," he said, and never finished the sentence because finishing it would have torn something in his mouth he had long relied on for orders. "She will not," Eulalie said, deciding. What followed was work, the kind with no room for spectacle, no patience for pride, the kind where the body surrenders what it cannot hold and the hands outside reminded how to forgive itself. Eulalie coaxed the placenta to release its jealous teeth. She bled with Abigail in her palms the way a midwife does when she lends her warmth and her will and some of her years. Dr. Vale held the lamp, badly, and learned, perhaps, a little about how quiet can be louder than any oath. The mistress returned with bricks so hot they were almost speech, wrapped in towels she had combed with her own hands to make soft. The master watched something he could not order into obedience and made room for it. Near dawn, the child came, not with a shout of conquest, but with a sound like a question asked politely. Eulalie caught her, small, perfect, a girl with a mouth that already knew how to close around a truth and hold it. She cut and tied and wrapped and laid the child to Abigail's breast, where relief and sorrow washed through together because the body keeps every weather report at once. "She is," Abigail began, and wept without ugliness. "She is," Eulalie said, and found her own eyes wet against her will. "She is here." The room exhaled without admitting men had been among its lungs. Dr. Vale put down his lamp and stepped back into the profession that had invited him. The mistress kissed her daughter's damp forehead without thinking of who watched. The master put his hand on the bedpost as if to steady it, and found it steadying him. Outside, the first birds invented morning again. Eulalie cleaned and ordered and then chose the corner of the room that would continue to breathe without her. She walked to the window and pushed it open onto air that seemed new-coined.
Behind her, soft and ordinary as a woman who has made it through, Abigail said, "Write me down now." Eulalie smiled into the yard. "I did already," she said, "but I will add the name." "What name?" the mistress asked, her voice suspecting a kind of theft it could not yet frame. "Abigail's," Eulalie said, "and the child's." She looked at Abigail. "Rosemary," Abigail said, looking past her mother to the pot on the veranda that had taught her how plants remember and forgive. "If she pleases." "She does," Eulalie said. She added the names in her head first, where no man could snatch them, and then later on the page, where anyone might, but not without a fight. You would think, because the child had come and the bleeding had consented to go, that the book and the graves and the river might be allowed their quiet. But certain men take peace as challenge. Before noon, the sheriff arrived with a badge that had shined up its courage for the occasion, and 2 men whose job was to carry someone else's decisions inside their belts. "There has been a report," the sheriff announced to the air outside the big house, where the master and Dr. Vale and the overseer and Eulalie had arranged themselves like chess pieces whose rules were being rewritten. "Disturbance of ground, unlawful burial, recording of—" He squinted at the paper in his hand, embarrassed by literacy's failure to make him sure. "Of the dead, without the proper say-so." "The proper say-so has been had," Eulalie said. The sheriff looked at her as if a chair had spoken. "You are midwife, witness, troublemaker," the master supplied. The sheriff nodded at the master because nodding at money is how breakfast gets on the table. "We'll see the place," he said, arranging his mouth ahead of his feet in case his steps led him somewhere his understanding had not yet gone. They went to the Chinaberries. The river affected indifference and did not fool anyone. The sheriff took off his hat the way men do when pretending to respect the dead while planning to change their arrangements. He looked at the small mounds, the shells, the stones that had decided to be necessary. He looked at the women who stood like trees and at the men who stood like shadows that would not disperse. He cleared his throat. "Law says," he began and then did not continue, because the law had not made provisions for decency done without its permission. "The law has not met all the dead," Eulalie said. "We introduced them to one another this morning." She opened the ledger again, because sometimes the only way through a man's insistence is to make a road out of ink. She read names until the sheriff's jaw loosened and his hat sagged into his own hands. Dr. Vale tried a different angle. "These burials," he said, peering as if medicine might be printed on the dirt. "Were any of these children—" He looked at the master and changed his word. "Mine." The room of the river did not like the way he had said it. Eulalie could have answered with a cut that would never scar. She did not. Mercy as a blade she kept sheathed until she needed to draw blood in the shape of kindness. They belonged to the women who bore them, and to no doctor. The mistress, pale with a complicated sum, spoke for the first time at the graves. "Have we done wrong?" she asked Eulalie, and though she meant the day, the question roamed farther back than any of them could walk. "Yes," Eulalie said, "because lying at a grave is bad company. And also today we have done right." The sheriff folded his paper as if that could conclude the matter. "Leave the ground," he said finally, "to the overseer more than to the women. If any more come loose, send word to town. No more digging without a preacher." "A preacher will come," Eulalie said. "He is late as usual, but he will come." She did not mean a man with a book.
They left the graves then, as if the river had dismissed them. The sheriff took with him a discomfort he would sit on at supper and pretend was bad beans. The overseer carried away a humiliation he would try to put down on the nearest back. Dr. Vale brought away a question he would never admit to in daylight. The master took nothing but the idea of a plan. Plans, when made by men who have had their will refused, usually involve fire. He waited until evening, when the quarters were lavender with fatigue, and babies had decided to keep their mothers an hour longer. He carried a lantern and his anger, and the weight of a name nobody outside his fence cared about. He went to the sick house. Isaac saw him first. The carpenter is always looking at corners for things that do not hold, and roused Eulalie with a hand on her arm gentle enough to be missed. "He's coming," he said, and that was all the sentence required. Eulalie stepped into the door of the sick house with the ledger already in her hands, because her body did not need to be told what it loved. The master stood in the yard, lantern held at throat height, as if he were about to swallow it. "The book," he said, and the words could have been a prayer if they had been to any god worth answering. "No," Eulalie said. He lifted the lantern then, high, as if to fling it and let fire argue with wood and paper and memory on his behalf. "Don't!" Abigail's voice traveled across the yard like a string thrown between windows. She stood on the veranda holding her child, the rosemary smell of her still clinging like a second name. "If you burn that, you burn me." The master froze, as men do when a woman declines to be a place to stand. The lantern tilted, caught a breath of wind that had not been there a second before, and hiccuped flame into the night without him. A corner of the sick house wall licked orange. Men shouted, women ran. Isaac jumped for the lantern and missed on purpose. He had a better aim in mind. He hit the burning corner with his palm and smothered it with his shirt while Eulalie passed him water that had been fetched while nobody was looking. The fire died of embarrassment before it had a chance to become a story with a bad ending. The master stood with his arm still in the air, a man who had rehearsed vengeance and been cut off after the first line. He lowered it slowly, like a curtain whose pulley had rusted. "Go back to your house," the mistress said to him, and nobody had ever heard her say anything that way. He went not because she had commanded him, but because the yard had decided he was out of season. The sick house kept its breath. Eulalie stood in the doorway with the ledger against her chest like a child and felt for the first time in a very long time the sensation of not being alone inside a decision. Around her, women picked up buckets and put them down empty and laughed a little, because laughter, when it is the first after a narrow thing, sounds like it does not know its own license. That night, the river rose a finger's width and then another, though the sky withheld rain. In the morning, a wind came that smelled of travel. The sheriff returned with a man in a long coat who wrote letters for the state and believed that made him the state. They asked very many questions that could be summarized by one: "Who gave you permission to keep a book?" Eulalie answered with very many words that could be summarized by a single one: "Birth." They tried again: "Where is your preacher?" "Here." She tapped the ledger, and "there." She nodded to the graves. The long coat man frowned as if the river's grammar were poor. "We will require the ledger for inspection." Eulalie considered the sentence the way a cook considers a piece of meat, deciding where to put the knife. She could refuse and pay for it with pain she had long ago stopped budgeting.
She could agree and risk the book's disappearance into rooms where men who had never held a woman's ankle during a contraction would speak about it carelessly until it died of boredom. Or she looked at Abigail, at Isaac, at Ruth, nursing her boy with a look that said a person can hold two worlds at once, at the river, which did not vote but made its position known. "I will read to you," she said to the long coat, "here, today, all of it." She held up the book so that the binding caught the light, and men who had thought themselves unassailable blinked. "Proceed," the long coat said, because paperwork cannot digest refusal. It took the day. It took the sun and some of the moon. Eulalie read every name. She read what weight a child had taken from its mother and what it had left behind. She read how many were born in storms and how many in droughts, as if the sky were a midwife too. She read the notes of who had sung and who had sat silent and who had held whose hand. She reached the last page where a square of flowered wallpaper made the book feel fancy enough to resist despair. And she read the final blank aloud so that it would be ready to receive. When she finished, the long coat had filled 2 packets with the scratch of his pen and a part of himself he would not name. The sheriff had forgotten to chew the tobacco he kept in the side of his mouth for moral support. Dr. Vale had taken off his gloves but kept his distance. The master had learned nothing and everything. The mistress had learned the opposite. "And now," Eulalie said, "we will return the ledger to its place."
"No," the master said, but the word behaved itself and sat down. Eulalie walked to the sick house and lifted the floor as if unsealing a vault without gold. She set the ledger inside next to the blue bottles and the thin shovel, and for the first time since she had cut the first page, she laid a sprig of rosemary on top, because remembering should smell of something living. She lowered the board. She stood. She felt the world take a step toward her without moving. Back at the Chinnaberries, the river flicked a fish, and nobody missed the metaphor. Women drifted away to their duties, which were holy. Men returned to their tools, which were not. The sheriff and his paperwork left. The long coat left. Dr. Vale lingered as men do when they want to be thanked and fear being cursed. He approached Eulalie with his hat in his hand, which was the only way to approach her that day without shame. "You saved her," he said, meaning Abigail, because naming women is something men like him do sparingly in order to make each instance a favor. "I did not know how." "You learned some," Eulalie allowed. "Hold the lamp steady next time." He nodded as if he had knighted him, and then remembered he had a wife in town who liked him best when he had no doubts. He left wearing an idea he would not show her. Evening came soft-footed. Abigail sent for Eulalie and placed Rosemary in her arms, a gesture with no precedent in that house. The child blinked, not at the light, which she took for granted, but at the face above hers, which she seemed to have been waiting to approve. "Keep her name safe, if I cannot," Abigail whispered. "You can, but I will." They stood like that a long moment, a circle in a place that had always preferred lines. The mistress watched from the chair by the window, her eyes full of arithmetic she had finally learned to do with her heart instead of her head. She said suddenly, "You will stay," and the statement wore no chain. "For now," Eulalie said. "Where else would I go? The river has my work to look after." The quiet after that was a kind that does not trust itself. Then from the yard came the sound of men's boots running and the particular salt to fear that rises when hounds are loosed on a thing that is not a rabbit. The overseer's voice, "Run away, boy from the stables, Shiloh, Camden, whatever name you call him, gone." Eulalie's breath stopped because fear is a jealous animal that wants all your attention.
The boy with the place name, the one who had knocked for Ruth and for Abigail, the one who moved between rooms like a bridge nobody taxed. She saw him in her mind running toward the cane, toward the river, toward the stand of trees where the ground had already shown it could open when asked. She handed Rosemary back to Abigail and was moving before her feet had agreed. Outside, the overseer had his men and their anger pointed like a rifle. The master saw her and mistook her for an obstacle. "Back," he ordered, because ordering is the last skill to leave a drowning man. Eulalie did not stop. She went to the chinnaberries. Isaac was already there, breath loud in his chest as if it had a message to deliver. "He jumped," Isaac said, pointing to the place where the bank cut under itself like a grudge. "Hound's lost his scent in the water. He's either clever as a fox or stupid as a man in love." "Which?" Eulalie asked. "Both," Isaac said. And that was when the boy's head broke the surface 30 yards downstream, hair slick, eyes wide with the kind of freedom that will likely kill you if it does not save you fast enough. "Hush!" Eulalie hissed, and the sound laid a cover over the water. The overseer and his men pounded onto the path. The hounds threw their voices ahead like stones and got them back bruised. The master arrived with a pistol he had never learned to use for anything but threatening furniture. The mistress came because some disasters cannot be gardened around. Dr. Vale came because he had run out of ways to explain himself. Abigail came because women do. "There!" the overseer shouted, and the hounds found the boy's wake and bayed as if hope were a debt to be collected savagely. "Stop," Eulalie said, and hissed, and the sound laid a cover over the water. She looked at the boy, and then at the river, and then at the graves, and then at the thin new line between her and everything she had buried that was not a body. She stepped into the water. It was cold as a truth you did not want but needed. It gripped her skirts and her thighs and her memory the way the past does when you try to step past it. She found the boy's arm under the surface by locating the fear in her own and matching it. She pulled him toward her with the strength of a woman who has wrestled more than children into the world. He coughed a river, and then a smaller river, and then air. The hounds reached the bank and lost their manners. The men reached the bank and lost their minds. The master raised his pistol to aim at the idea of disobedience. "Fire, and I drown us both," Eulalie said, not loudly, but to the part of the day that makes decisions. The pistol hesitated as if remembering it had been made by hands. "Let him come back," Eulalie told the river, and the river, which had developed a fondness for the way she asked for things, made a path of slow water around them and pushed them toward the shallows like a mother whose patience had run out with danger. They climbed onto the bank amid a citizenship of mud. The boy's chest ran like clatter. Eulalie put her hand on it until it remembered the baseline. The overseer stepped forward, hand on a rope he kept for occasions he called justice and Eulalie called boredom.
"No," Abigail said, and the word had a new muscle in it. "He came to fetch help. He saved me." It was not true, but the truth served the wrong God too often to be left alone. The mistress stood beside her daughter and did not look at her husband when she did it. "Release him," she said to the overseer. The man looked to the master for permission, the way small kings do when God gets complicated. The master flicked his hand as if at a fly. "Tie him at the post," he said. "We'll talk when I am not wet." The boy flinched, and Eulalie felt the ledger in her pocket turn hot as if a page had caught fire. She stood up, water sliding off her like an argument. "You will not tie him," she said. "You will hear me." "Enough," the master growled. "I will hear nothing." "Then you will feel it," Eulalie said, and the day accepted the wager.
The river took a breath that bent the chinaberries. The bank that had slid before slid again. The ground under the overseer's boots changed its mind about supporting him. He windmilled, ridiculous as a rooster on ice, then dropped the rope as if it had burned him. He fell to his knees and scrambled backward, humility forced on him by geology. The hounds yelped and reconsidered their opinions about loyalty and landscapes that shift. A silence followed, like the quiet after a story finds its true ending. The master lowered his pistol because his arm had become ridiculous to itself. The boy edged behind Eulalie like a small boat finding a pier. Isaac stood a little closer to both of them than a carpenter generally stands to his projects. The mistress looked at the river the way a woman looks at a mirror that for the first time returns a face that is not a stranger. "Let it be," she said to her husband, and this time he heard her because the ground had spoken first. They walked back from the water slowly, like people leaving church, some with relief and some with the itch of unconfessed things. The boy with the place name kept his breath near Eulalie's, taking hits off it when his own faltered. When they reached the yard, Abigail took him by the hand as if she had been born to it. "You will carry my child's shawl," she said, and only Eulalie caught the brilliance of the lie. By afternoon, the yard remembered how to pretend. Work resumed its imitation of ease. Men hammered a loose plank because hammering can keep the heart from climbing out of a man's throat. Women cooked food because a pot insists. Children invented a game that involved running between two shadows and never letting the shadows catch you. Eulalie went to the sick house and lifted the floor one last time. She touched the ledger like a cheek. She placed the blue bottle in its place and the thin shovel across both like a guardian asleep in a doorway. She pressed the boards down and stood until the shape of her footsteps had been erased by the ordinary movements of a day. Isaac waited outside, leaning on the doorframe as if the wood would notice and be grateful. "You could go," he said softly. "You could walk downriver. There are people there who know your name without you telling it." "I could," Eulalie said. She looked toward the chinaberries, which flicked their leaves like gossip relayed kindly. "But I belong to the kept things, to the buried grief that needs a mouth to say it is not a sin." He nodded because love learns how to agree with duty without pretending they are the same. "Then I will be here when you open the door." "Bring nails," she said. And he smiled with his whole face, which is a rare way for a man to uncover himself. Evening put its hands on the shoulders of the place and pressed down gently until everybody sat. Abigail came with Rosemary bundled against the fall that was not yet visible and would always be arriving. The mistress walked with them, discovering that her feet could go where she had never asked them to. The master stood on the veranda and watched, like a man who has seen his own future and dislikes its haircut. Eulalie took Rosemary and raised her so the child could see the chinaberries and the river and the sky that changes without asking. "You will bury some things," she told the infant, "and they will not be sins. They will be seeds." Isaac hammered the first nail into the sick house doorframe, not to shut anything in, but to fasten something true to the place. The sound traveled across the yard, clean and ordinary and final. Eulalie looked at the river and did not ask it for anything. She had learned at last how to let a friend rest. That night, before she slept, she wrote the last line she would need for a while. Abigail, delivered of a daughter, Rosemary, mother and child kept, doctor held lamp steadier, river respectful, the ground agreed to keep what it had kept, ledger read aloud, names now heavier and easier to carry. She closed the book. She closed her eyes. She did not pray. She had already been heard.